For those of you who weren't here on Sunday, I officially began my break from studying through Matthew and began my series in which I said we were going to study the Priesthood of King David, as I call it. And I started that on Sunday. And that message on Sunday was an introductory message, just really designed to lay out some of the ideas that need to be fresh in our minds as we begin this study. And I laid out 4 foundational ideas, and I just wanted to review them here at the beginning so we're all on the same page, especially those of us who were not here last time. So first, I reviewed the events of the books of Samuel with an emphasis on the life of David. Of course, David is the primary character in this series on the priesthood of David, so I wanted to make sure his life was fresh in your mind. I also stressed that the books of Samuel are actually the book of Samuel. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, even though we divide them up and call them that, they were originally just one book that we split in 2 for the convenience of it. So it means that's one story told by one author who's driving at a unified purpose in telling that story. And one of those things he wants to get at you in your mind is the priesthood of David, as I call it, this idea that David is in some sense portrayed as a priest. So that was the first thing I did. Secondly, I reviewed the laws from the law of Moses about priesthood. Since priesthood is such an important factor in this whole series, I wanted to go to what God actually said about that in the law he gave Israel. And those laws altogether indicate how strange it would be for David to be considered a priest because, first of all, he's not from the right family. He's not from the house of Aaron, so he's not really from the right family to be a priest. Secondly, he doesn't do the usual work of a priest, ministering in the tabernacle, performing sacrifices, doing all that sort of thing. And then finally, the priesthood of David would create some tension with the perpetual priesthood promised to the sons of Aaron, because God promised Aaron's house the priesthood perpetually, forever, and yet for David to come in and be considered a priest would imply that something went wrong there, or at least some kind of tension. So all of that, all those laws regarding priests are very important background information for everything we're doing in this series. Third, I explained the importance of viewing David as a priest by discussing the effect of that idea on the way we read the whole Bible. So taking it well beyond the books of Samuel, your reading of the entirety of Scripture is going to be somewhat affected by this. I gave 2 consequences for this idea of the priesthood of King David. First, if King David is a priest, then David foreshadows Christ in even more ways than you may have previously thought. Certainly you think of David as a type of Christ in terms of kingship. You might have caught on and thought of that in the same way as in the topic of prophet, being a prophet. David is called a prophet, not very often, but it does happen, and Christ also is a prophet. But if David is also a priest of some sort, then he foreshadows Christ in that way as well. So that's 3 ways: prophet, priest, and king. So that's a pretty big consequence. Second consequence is that the priesthood of David shows that the priesthood of Aaron failed much sooner than you may have realized. We usually think of these old covenant laws and institutions failing when Jesus comes and brings the new covenant. But a careful reading of the Old Testament shows you that very often those old covenant institutions and laws start to kind of die out even before Christ comes. They start to crumble away. And you see that in this case with the priesthood of Aaron, and how David is in some sense a replacement for the house of Aaron as priests. And then the fourth thing I did in that introductory message was I addressed the indirect and barely noticeable way that the books of Samuel handle such a radical doctrine as the priesthood of David. You would think that something like that would be more forward and more in your face and easier to see. But if what I'm saying is true, then it's a very subtle, very unclear aspect of the book that you're not going to realize upon a first reading, most likely. But I said that that was actually typical of God, especially when dealing with speaking through prophets and things like that. In the Old Testament, his revelation is very often obscure. It's not clear. And there's very often these strange passages that come in that don't make a whole lot of sense, but when you really start to think about them, then they start to point you to something meaningful, especially Christ in a lot of ways. And I think the priesthood of David is found in passages like that. So it is actually very typical of God to do that sort of thing. So all of that was foundational And now with the second message, I can move into the real substance of what I want to talk about with this priesthood of David. Today's message is called The Failure of the Priesthood of Aaron. And with a title like that, it's very evident what this is about. My main point tonight is simply that in the days of Samuel and David, God began to transfer the priesthood from Aaron's house to David's house. So way back in that time, you start to see a transfer of priesthood take place from the house of Aaron to the house of David. Now my outline today has 3 points to just take all of that and lay it out in an orderly fashion. First, by the time of Samuel, the house of Aaron had become wicked. So here stressing the wickedness of the priests at that time. And that's really important because it really is the driving force for what God was doing to them and later on doing for David. And that leads into my second point, which is because of its wickedness, because of the wickedness of the household of Aaron, the house of Aaron lost the priesthood which God had promised them perpetually. So the promise that God made to them forever was actually conditional, and when they started getting so wicked, God had to do something about that, and so basically revoked the promise of priesthood from them. Thirdly, the judgment on the house of Aaron began immediately and continued into the days of David. It doesn't take long in the books of Samuel for us to see judgment start to fall on the house of Aaron. And then when David comes along, you start to see him assume, to some degree, a very priestly role. We'll get a little bit into that tonight, but not too much. Tonight we're very much focusing on the beginning chapters of the books of 1 Samuel and really focusing on the house of Aaron at that time. Now in my last message, I made reference to the tension between the priesthood of Aaron and this priesthood of David that I think permeates the books of Samuel. I say tension, I mean that these two things should not be happening together. One of them, you might say, the priesthood of David, should not be happening at all, because by all rights, according to the law, he should not be a priest, and Israel already had priests. So there is tension there in this whole idea that I'm talking about tonight. Well, in today's message, I'm going to relieve that tension somewhat by showing how the priesthood of Aaron and his descendants had already started to end, had already been revoked by God in some sense by the time David becomes a national hero in Israel. So God does something very definitively here in these opening chapters of Samuel to show you that this priesthood is coming to an end, and there's going to be a new priesthood coming along that the author of Samuel is going to tell you about. Now I expect that to sound somewhat bizarre, since it is well known that the men of Aaron's house continued to serve as priests for a full millennium after the time of David. Even when you get into the time of Christ, you still have men who are very much descendants of Aaron serving in some capacity in the priesthood. We don't need to get into much detail with that, but they were there. So there were still priests from the line of Aaron well after the time of David for about 1,000 years. But what I hope to show is that in the times of David and of Samuel and David, back in this time, God began to transfer that priesthood. So it wasn't an absolute flick of a switch kind of thing. It just means that God did something back then that was definitive, that was very pivotal, and set in motion the events that would eventually lead to a new priesthood, embodying the person of Christ ultimately. And back here in the days of Samuel and David, God began to move in that direction, so that when Christ finally comes and that old priesthood finally comes to a complete end, there was actually some warning about that, and if you had been reading your Bible carefully, you would have seen it. So that's really what I'm getting into tonight, relieving some of that tension just by showing you the gradual transfer that began at this time, right before the time of David, when God effectively discontinued the priesthood of Aaron, at least in some sense. It'll make sense as I go through it more. Let's start with the first point here. Doubtless the easiest point, because these first chapters of Samuel are very plain on this. By the time of Samuel, the prophet and judge of Israel, by the time of Samuel, the house of Aaron had become wicked. So the priests of Israel, who are supposed to embody the law and embody righteousness, at this time were very wicked men. Now, before moving right into that, I want to remind you just of what these early chapters of 1 Samuel record. We'll be dodging around a lot in these first 4 chapters or so. So just to remind you of what's actually happening here, it starts with the parents of Samuel, the man who would eventually become a prophet and the last judge of Israel. So his parents are Elkanah and Hannah, and we get the story of Samuel's birth and everything happening there. Before long, we're introduced to the man who is high priest at this time. His name is Eli. He's a very important character here at the beginning. And we also meet his 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who are the sons of Eli and also priests. One of them, by rights, would have become high priest if things had turned out differently for them. But we meet those men. They are the main priests of Israel at this time. Mostly, this part of the book is a record of the sins of those priests and the consequences of those sins. So we see Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas as sinners and what God did to them because of their sins. In response to those sins, God sends a man of God, a prophet, to pronounce judgment on Eli and his family, including the whole priestly house of Aaron. So in response to the wickedness of the priests in those days, God sends a prophet who says, hey, you just messed up, and here's what I'm going to do about you guys and your entire house, the house of Aaron. And we do not need to wait long to see the beginning of that judgment on the house of Aaron, because before long, Eli and his sons are dead. The first wave of that judgment happens very quickly after the man of God comes and delivers his judgment, and there's more coming even later in the book. But at least in these first few chapters, we see judgment fall swiftly. Now, as I said, that judgment happened because of the sins of the priests. Because Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas were so wicked, God had to judge them. Now, I want to start with the sons of Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas, because their sins are the sins that are easiest to see. They lay very much on the surface of the book. You don't have to look too hard. So let's read some passages about them. The first sin, and the source of all their other sins, was hypocrisy. So that is people who treat righteousness as a kind of role play. They don't really mean it. They just kind of go through the motions of holiness, but in their hearts they're actually quite wicked and sinful and not devoted to God at all. I start with that sin in Hophni and Phinehas, not only because it causes all the other sins, but because you might miss it. It's mentioned so briefly that you might actually pass over it, but 1 Samuel 2, verse 12, when we see these men, what it says about them is very telling. So 1 Samuel 2, verse 12 says this, "Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord." Okay, now think about that. Here are 2 men, priests, who in some sense are the physical representatives of the worship of God. They're the ones there in the tabernacle officiating over all the formal worship of God that was happening at that time. But for them, it was all show. It was fake. They were like actors playing a part. But why? Because they did not know the Lord. I mean, you're a priest and you don't know God. That's a huge problem. Since they don't know God, you would expect other sins to follow. I mean, if they haven't taken it upon themselves to earnestly seek after God and make sure that He is a real part of their lives, you can expect there to be other forms of wickedness in these men's lives. And there were. This passage goes on to continue with a sin that gets a lot of attention at this point in the book, and that is their habit of stealing from the offerings. So people bringing in their sacrifices to offer to God, and these men, Hophni and Phinehas, actually steal from those offerings. Start again in verse 12, and we'll read through verse 17. "Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord, and the custom of the priests with the people. When any man was offering a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come while the meat was boiling with a 3-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and all that the fork brought up the priest would take for himself. Thus they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, 'Give the priest meat for roasting, as he will not take boiled meat from you, only raw.' If the man said to him, 'They must surely burn the fat first, and then take as much as you desire,' then he would say, 'No, but you shall give it to me now, and if not, I'll take it by force.' So they have kind of a guy that you might call the muscle out there saying, 'Hey, give the priest his food.' Like, well, we got to do it this way. he says, no, give it now. Give it now. Thus the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men despised the offering of the Lord. So, there you have it. Priests stealing from the offerings, just taking food that ought to be offered to God and taking it for themselves. And since God is no one to these two men, they don't know the Lord. Since God is no one to these two men, it makes sense that they should have no problem stealing from God. Who is the Lord? Why should I care? Why should I care to take this food that's being offered to him and take it for myself? So that's what they're doing. Now that's just part of their sins. We've covered their hypocrisy, stealing from the offerings. There's another sin, and this sin is actually sexual sin. Just jump down a little further here to 1 Samuel 2, verse 22. It says, Now Eli, their father, was very old, and he heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. So now we have these women who in some sense have dedicated themselves to serving God. We don't know exactly what that means, but in some sense these women have come here to the tabernacle to be part of the tabernacle service there as part of this public worship of God. And the response of Hophni and Phinehas to this is to seduce them, to use their position and influence and all that to actually lay with these women. So that is a pretty grievous sin. I mean, you have these women who back then probably, you're talking about the ancient equivalent of what we would think of as nuns, and here they are just sleeping with these women. So here you have a third sin, a very egregious sin that they're committing. And all that coming together here, you have their hypocrisy, you have the stealing from the offerings, and now you have this sexual sin. But there's one more sin we can mention from Hophni and Phinehas, and that is their refusal to repent. Let's keep reading in that passage that we started with Eli here. And it says, Eli said to them, Why do you do such things, the evil things that I hear from all these people? No, my sons, for the report is not good which I hear the Lord's people circulating. If one man sins against another, God will mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for the Lord desired to put them to death. So it's kind of already too late for them. God has already decided to put them to death. But you see in all of that, they do not repent. He comes to them with a warning of some sort to some degree, and they do not heed that. So hypocrisy, stealing, sexual immorality, and now stubbornness. These two priests are thoroughly wicked. And to think at least one of them, if things had turned out differently, would have been destined to become high priest. You would have had a high priest, eventually with a record of being a hypocrite, stealing from the offerings, seducing women, and refusing to repent. That man could have been your high priest. Not sure if it would have been Hophni or Phinehas, but one of them could have been that. So you see the great sins of Eli's sons at this time. But that's not all. It's not just the sins of Eli's sons. There is also the sins of Eli to deal with. Eli himself is also wicked. And you might think that kind of strange because upon a casual reading of these opening chapters, you might think of Eli as being more on God's side, especially in the passage we just read about Eli's sons and him confronting them in some way. But in reality, a closer reading shows you that Eli himself is not a righteous man. Truly, his sons were his sons. They followed in his footsteps in some degree. First of all, when you first meet Eli in this book, you cannot help but be amazed at his lack of spiritual perception. He's a man that doesn't seem very sharp when it comes to matters of religion at all. I want to go to 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9, and read what happens here. This is when Hannah, the mother of Samuel, is still praying for a son. 1 Samuel 1, verse 9, we'll read through verse 14. Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come upon his head. She'll make him a Nazirite, in other words. Now it came about as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, but only her lips were moving. Her voice was not heard. And so Eli thought she was drunk. Then Eli said to her, "How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you." Now, how many times, this is a question for you, how many times have you seen anybody pray and thought they were drunk? I mean, just how often has that happened? It's a very unusual response for a person to have. Seeing somebody pray, I mean, even if their mouth is moving and they're not actually speaking, I mean, she's there in the tabernacle. I mean, she's probably knelt down in some capacity, adopting the typical prayer posture. And here the high priest comes in and says, "Hey, this woman's drunk." It's like, has he ever seen anybody pray? I mean, has he ever prayed? Has he ever prayed earnestly about anything? I mean, it's a strange response for the high priest to have, to see somebody praying earnestly and not recognize what's going on. It's just unusual for a high priest to have such a lack of spiritual perception. It's our first impression of Eli, and it's not a very good one. I mean, it shows you that to some degree, his own mood on the matters of God is shallow. I mean, it just shows you that he doesn't really have much of a perception for what's going on around him and what God is doing around him. Perhaps hypocrisy is too strong a term, but maybe we could at least say shallowness in terms of Eli's mood toward the things of God. But then secondly, another thing with Eli here is he's also guilty, much like his sons, of overindulging on the sacrifices being brought there to the temple. Now, in some sense, you see Hophni and Phinehas stealing food from the offerings. To some degree, priests are supposed to get some of that food. The problem with Hophni and Phinehas was they were taking too much, and they were taking it even by threatening force to do so. They have their guy out there threatening people to give food early before conducting the proper sacrifice. Eli doesn't seem to be doing anything like that, but Eli himself is guilty of some overindulgence on this food. Let's go to 1 Samuel 2, verse 29. This is when the man of God has actually come and has confronted Eli about the things that he and his sons are doing and gives the punishment that God is going to work against them. Let's read verse 29 out of that. This is the man of God speaking for God. "Why do you kick at my sacrifice and my offering which I have commanded in my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by making yourselves fat with the choicest of every offering of my people Israel?" Now, the interesting thing about that is the man of God did not say that Eli's sons made themselves fat on those offerings. The man of God includes Eli. Why have you made yourselves fat with these offerings? You notice how he includes him in that? And some of the descriptions you have of Eli imply that he's a very overweight man, so he's been really overindulging here. You get the impression he's been taking too many offerings as well and not leaving enough for God to have on the altar as part of this sacrificial system going on. So here you have, the sons of Eli are out there stealing food, yes, from the offerings, but where'd they learn that? They learned it from their father, who's also making himself fat off of these offerings. So Eli is setting a very poor example for his sons, who just took it one step further and now just out stealing from these offerings. So there's a second sin of Eli. There's one more, and that is this. Eli's rebuke to his sons is not a rebuke. And this is the strangest point of them. Eli's rebuke to his sons was not a real rebuke. I mentioned the passage where you have the sons of Eli stealing from the altar and seducing these women, and Eli says, "No, my sons, what you're doing is not right." That might sound like a rebuke. He goes to them and in some sense confronts them for their sins. However, the way God views it, that was not a proper rebuke. And I base this on something God tells Samuel to tell Eli later on after the young boy Samuel starts hearing from God. Let's read 1 Samuel 3, verse 10 through 14. Something that really takes me aback whenever I read it. 1 Samuel 3, 10 through 14 says, "The Lord came and stood and called out as at other times, 'Samuel, Samuel.' And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." The Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day I will carry out against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knew, because his sons brought a curse on themselves, and he did not rebuke them. Therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever." Did you notice there that God says Eli did not rebuke his sons? So even though we see this passage earlier where he does issue some kind of warning to them, God does not consider that a proper rebuke. Now, we can only guess as to why. I have two guesses that I think are decent. One is he might have waited too long, letting all this rumor circulate throughout the whole nation before finally acting. And secondly, he did not back up that rebuke with actions by removing his sons from the priesthood. He is the high priest. He has the authority to say, okay, you two want to misuse your power and do things wrong like this, you're not priests anymore. Game over. He has the authority to do that, and he should have done that because these men brought such disgrace upon the priestly office. But instead, he just uses words. And because he only uses words, his rebuke is not really a proper rebuke. He didn't go far enough. Too little, too late. We have that expression. And that describes what Eli does with his sons. Too little, too late. So we have two wicked sons and one worthless father leading the house of Aaron at this time. Not only are Hophni and Phinehas engaged in very open sins, but you have Eli kind of in his own kind of sins, not as clear, but still very much there. This man, Eli, is not a truly godly man. So there you have it, the house of Aaron, the high priest and his two sons, not men of righteousness, very wicked men. And that sets the stage for what happens next. Brings me to my second point. Because of its wickedness, the house of Aaron lost the priesthood which God had promised them perpetually. Even though God promised the sons of Aaron that they would have the priesthood forever, God says, never mind. You just lost it because of your wickedness. Now, I've already read part of this, but let's go ahead and read the full thing. Let's read the full judgment made by that man of God against Eli in 1 Samuel 2, starting in verse 27. And we'll read through 36. I did read this on Sunday, but let's read it again. Then a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, did I not indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt in bondage to Pharaoh's house? Did I not choose them from all the tribes of Israel to be my priests, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to carry an ephod before me? And did I not give to the house of your father all the fire offerings of the sons of Israel? Why do you kick at my sacrifice and my offering which I have commanded in my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by making yourselves fat with the choicest of every offering of my people Israel? Therefore the Lord God of Israel declares, I did indeed say that your house and the house of your father should walk before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. For those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me will be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days are coming when I will break your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. You will see the distress of my dwelling, in spite of all the good that I do for Israel, and an old man will never be in your house forever. Yet I will not cut off every man of yours from my altar, so that your eyes will fail from weeping and your soul grieve, and all the increase of your house will die in the prime of life. This will be the sign to you, which will come concerning your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. On the same day, both of them will die. But I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who will do according to what is in my heart and in my soul, and I will build him an enduring house, and he will walk before my anointed always. Everyone who is left in your house will come and bow down to him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, and say, Please assign me to one of the priest's offices, so that I may eat a piece of bread. All right, so to summarize that message of judgment, God promises 3 punishments to the house of Eli, which is also the house of Aaron at this time. 3 punishments. So here they are. First of all, no man of the house of Aaron would live long enough to be called an old man. He says several times in there will not be an old man in your house, which means everyone's going to die young. They're not going to be, there is no live long and prosper here in the house of Eli. They're all going to die young. Secondly, God will raise up a new priest with an enduring house who would actually obey God. So they're being replaced. They're game over for the house of Aaron. Now it's time for a new faithful priest to take over. And he's going to have an enduring house in place of the house of Aaron. And then finally, the survivors of Aaron's house will be dependent on the new priest. They will come and beg him for work and for money and for bread. They'll be dependent on this new faithful priest. Now, of everything in that message of judgment, the only truly problematic promise is that the perpetual priesthood of Aaron seems to be revoked. Again, verse 30. Therefore the Lord God of Israel declares, I did indeed say that your house and the house of your father should walk before me forever. God said that. I did say, your house will walk before me forever. And God doesn't lie, right? And God keeps his promises, right? We've been telling the kids all that, for all this time. We've been teaching them on Wednesday nights. So for God to say otherwise would be very unusual. And this is what he says. Now he says, far be it from me. For those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me will be lightly esteemed. And then he goes on to promise this replacement that he has in mind. So the perpetual priesthood of Aaron seems to be revoked by this man of God. And I call that problematic because if the priesthood was perpetual, it should be irrevocable. If God promised this to them forever, it shouldn't disappear at any point. Let's go back to Exodus 29:9. Well, you don't have to. I'm going there. Just to read it briefly. I read this on Sunday when I was reviewing the laws about the priesthood from the law of Moses. There's several passages where God tells the house of Aaron they will have this priesthood forever. And this is one of them, verse 9 in chapter 29 of Exodus. You shall gird them with sashes, Aaron and his sons, and bind caps on them, and they shall have the priesthood by a perpetual statute. So you shall ordain Aaron and his sons. So a law that lasts forever, a perpetual statute. And yet this man of God indicates a change in plans for the priesthood, even a new priesthood in which the sons of Aaron will limp along in a dependent role. Rather than them having the priesthood forever, now there's going to be this new faithful priest, and the house of Aaron, what's left of it, is going to be dependent on him. It's all very different than what God promises in the law of Moses. However, the man of God does provide an answer to this dilemma. He does give a reason for why this is happening. He implies, that the promise made to Aaron was conditional. That is to say, it's a promise. Well, here, I want to explain this actually for the children in detail, just so you kids know what a conditional promise is or what a condition is. So the word conditional means this. If someone makes a promise to you, and you only get what is promised if you do something that you promise as well, that's conditional. So if this person says, okay, I'll do this for you if you do this for me, and you agree to that, that is a conditional promise. You're only going to get the thing that was promised to you if you follow through with what you said you were going to do. So it's kind of like a partnership. You've got both people making a promise, and you only get what was promised to you if you actually do what you agreed to do. So your mom or your dad promises you that you can go outside to play if you finish cleaning your room, right? It's like, okay, you want to go out and play, that's fine. But clean your room first, and then I'll let you go out and play. And then you don't clean your room, guess what? Your parents don't have to keep that promise because you didn't do what you should have done. You should have cleaned your room. Then you would have been able to go outside. Okay, that's a condition. That's how a condition works. Now, God sometimes deals with people in a similar way. Not every promise of God is this way. Certainly the promises we've been talking about on Wednesday nights are the sort that don't have conditions, where God just promises these things to his people. But sometimes there are these conditional promises that God makes. And in those cases, you only get what God promised if you obey God in return. And that is what I think is happening here when we talk about the house of Aaron losing the priesthood that God promised them forever. Listen to the rationale given by the man of God in the judgment he gives. He actually explains to you why this is happening. Again, verse 30, back there in 1 Samuel 2. He says, I did indeed say that the house of your house and the house of your father would walk before me forever, but now the Lord declares, far be it for me, for, here's your reason, those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me will be lightly esteemed. So, God honors his promise to people, but only if they honor him. And if they despise God and they don't honor him, then God says, okay, I'll treat you the same way. That's the underwriting idea here of this revoking of the priesthood of Aaron. Those who honor me, I will honor. According to the man of God, the reason that God can revoke the promise made to Aaron is that God should only honor those who honor him, and that those who despise God deserve to be despised by God. So one for one here. I mean, God treats people the way they treat him when these conditional promises are in view. Now that argument that the man of God makes there is a sound argument. I think it works. And I can argue that by analogy with another covenant made by God at around the same time as he made that promise to the house of Aaron, and that is his covenant with all Israel, what we call the Old Covenant. That covenant was also a conditional covenant, a conditional promise. When God made that covenant with Israel, he promised them many things, right? A land of their own, domination of their enemies, abounding population, and really he promised them the greatest thing of all, that he himself would be their God. Lots of good promises in the Old Covenant, and God really did promise those things. But remember, that covenant was conditional upon Israel's obedience. Just to read you one of the passages where you see this. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 30, which I did not mark. Thankfully, I can find it really quick here. Deuteronomy 30, verse 15. This is Moses' exhortation to Israel toward the end of his life. Deuteronomy 30, verse 15 through 20. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, and death and adversity, in that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. But if your heart turns away, and you will not obey, but you are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you will surely perish. You will not prolong your days in the land where you are crossing the Jordan to enter it and possess it. I call heaven and earth as witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, and by holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land with which the Lord your God swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. So the old covenant was forever, and it had a lot of good promises, but only if they obeyed. And you see there very clearly, if you don't obey, you don't get any of this stuff. Instead, you get God as your enemy. So if the old covenant was a promise, made very much forever, but made conditionally, then it seems a pretty good bet that the priesthood with Aaron is the same way, that God promised this to them perpetually, but it was a conditional promise, and if the sons of Aaron ever went astray and ever became wicked, God had every right to revoke that promise and cancel it and say, no more. You're not going to be my priests anymore. So by analogy, I think we have every reason to expect that what the man of God says to Eli was correct when he said that the promise made to Aaron was a conditional promise. And God is not required to honor the house of Aaron if the house of Aaron despises God. And that is how the wickedness of the house of Aaron cost them the priesthood that God had promised to them perpetually. And that was my second point. Okay, one more thing to talk about tonight. And this gets us a little more into matters of David. But the judgment on the house of Aaron began immediately and continued into the days of David. So it didn't take long for these terrible things that the man of God told Eli to start coming true. To show you this, I want to target the three main punishments that I gave you earlier, one by one, and show you how each came true, or at least how each of them started to come true. So first of all, the house of Aaron would be consistently afflicted by early deaths. There will not be an old man in your house. That is the way the man of God words it. There will never be an old man in your house forever, or things of that nature, which basically means everyone's going to die young in the house of Aaron. Now this punishment began with the death of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And the man of God promises as much. He actually says, this is a sign that's going to come true to prove to you that these things are right. Your sons are going to die in one day. And you see that when the sons of Eli decide to go out into battle against the Philistines, and they bring with them the Ark of the Covenant. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 10 says, So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent, and the slaughter was very great, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. A lot. And the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So, the man of God specifically mentioned that Hophni and Phinehas would die on the same day. They die on the same day right here. But that is only the beginning. That is just the beginning of this idea that there's not going to be an old man in the house of Aaron anymore. That's just the beginning. Because not long after the death of Eli and his sons, Eli dies soon thereafter too. We'll talk about that later. But not long after these events, a whole city of priests would suffer a great slaughter from the hand of God himself. Okay? Didn't hear me? I'll say that again. A whole city of priests is about to die, or much of that city is about to die at the hand of God. Now, the passage I'm about to read will be treated in more detail in my next sermon. It's actually very important for my next sermon. But for right now, just bear this in mind. The city being described is a priestly city. We're going to talk about the city of Beth Shemesh, which if you read other parts of the Bible, you'll find out that city was a city where a lot of priests lived. Okay? So 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 19. Okay, this is after the ark was taken. The ark is returned to Israel. It goes to Beth Shemesh. And then this is what happens at Beth Shemesh. God struck down some of the men of Beth Shemesh because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. It says he struck down some of the men of Beth Shemesh. Well, how many is some? He struck down of all the people 50,070. Don't forget the 70. It's important against all those 50,000 that were struck down. 50,070 men. And the people mourned because the Lord had struck the people with a great slaughter. So here you have Beth Shemesh, which I said was a city of priests. I know that because in Joshua chapter 21, when they're dividing out the land between all the tribes of Israel, the priests get certain cities, and Beth Shemesh is one of the cities given to the priests. So this is a city of priests. This is where priests and future priests and their wives and their children live, okay? And this city, because of its mishandling of the ark of God, gets slaughtered, 50,070 killed by God. So this is a great slaughter for the house of Aaron. I mean, one whole priestly city. Surely it was a huge chunk of that city just gone because they mistreated the ark of God. So there you have a whole priestly city just being killed off, or much of it anyway. And yet, that is not the only time in the book of 1 Samuel where a city of priests gets absolutely massacred because of, well, the curse against the house of Aaron. There's another event where this happens. Later on in the book of Samuel, when Saul is king and Saul is hunting for David, because David's an outlaw at this point, David gets some help from the priests who were at a city called Nob. And guess what happens? Well, another massacre. Let's go to 1 Samuel 22. This is, I guess, about a generation or so later, but still, you see this curse against Eli's house is in full operation. 1 Samuel 22, we'll start in verse 16. That should be enough to give you an idea. The king in this passage is King Saul, not King David. It says this, "But the king said, 'You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household.'" Well, that sounds familiar. You and all your father's household. Ahimelech is the high priest at this point, by the way. "And the king said to the guards who were attending him, 'Turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand is also with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing, and they did not reveal it to me.' But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands and attack the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, 'You turn around and attack the priests.' And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod." So stop there. 85 priests die in one day at the hand of one man because they got on the bad side of King Saul. But that's not all. Verse 19, "And he struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, oxen, donkeys, sheep, struck with the edge of the sword." So even the animals of the priests don't survive. Another city of priests. So Beth Shemesh gets practically wiped out by God himself. And then another city of priests, the city of Nob, gets wiped out by King Saul. You and your father's house. I mean, wow. So you have this is horrible. I mean, imagine you are part of the house of Aaron. You've heard about this death sentence that the man of God uttered against Eli, to where there's not going to be an old man in your house. And within your lifetime, you see two whole cities of priests wiped out in one way or another. Now that covers the generation or so following Eli. Now the man of God said that Aaron's house would never have an old man ever again. You know, the idea that this kind of early death thing would continue forever. We cannot trace the entire history of the house of Aaron ever after. We can't do that. We can't like go to every single man in the house of Aaron and say, yeah, he died early, and he died early, and he died early. We can't do that. However, we can say this: for people living in that time and place, there was no doubt God had a vendetta against the priests. God told Eli, there's not going to be an old man in your house, and he got priests getting slaughtered left and right. So they're all pretty sure this is happening. I mean, there is no reason to doubt in that time and place that this punishment was happening all around them. So that's the first punishment. There's not going to be an old man in the house of Eli or the house of Aaron. They're all going to die early deaths. Okay. Second punishment. This one is made a little bit more confusing because of a translation issue. However, the second punishment is that Eli would see the distress of the dwelling place of God. So Eli, the man who was high priest at that time, is going to see the distress of the dwelling place of God. Now, if you're reading the NASB translation like I am, you will see the man of God tell Eli this in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 32. And it might help to actually go back there. I would love for those of you using the ESV to follow along especially well. But those of you who have the NASB like me, read verse 32 with me here. He says, "You will see the distress of my dwelling, in spite of all the good that I do for Israel." Okay, you will see the distress of my dwelling. That's what you read if you're using the NASB. Now, for those of you using the ESV, you might read something a little different. And I do want to take a poll here because I've noticed that sometimes the ESV in its different revisions says different things. But in my copy of the ESV, it says something very different. It says, "In distress you will look with envious eye on all the prosperity that shall be bestowed on Israel." In distress you will look with envious eye on all the prosperity that shall be bestowed on Israel. Does anyone using the ESV not see that by chance? Who's using the ESV tonight? You? Verse 32. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 32. You there? So I know Scott's using the ESV. Is anyone else using ESV tonight? Jared, Leah, Angela, you? Okay. Are you seeing that, or are you seeing something else? You're seeing that. Okay. So. Well, okay. I missed a word. Oh no. Okay. So the ESV says something very different, and I went through and compared online a great many Bible translations and discovered that the ESV is pretty unique here, meaning that except for one other Bible translation, the ESV is the only one who says that. The other Bible translation is the NLT, the New Living Translation. So you have two Bible translations that say this thing here about the NVSI and all that, whereas everyone else says something more like the NASB says. So it's kind of puzzling to see that. I mean, you got most Bible translations saying basically what the NASB says, and then you have the ESV kind of doing its own thing, and the New Living Translation as well following the ESV. I studied this difference in translation for a whole afternoon. I just want you to know I put some effort into this, okay? I try to do this whenever Bible translations differ, try to figure out what's going on in the original language. You know, here it's Hebrew. What's going on in the Hebrew text? My conclusion is really frustrating to me, but this is the best I can do, okay? After a whole afternoon of study, this is the best thing I can determine. It seems to me that the ESV and the NLT as well, their translators just did not see the word meon, the Hebrew word meon, which is dwelling place. It seems to me that when they got to this verse, for some reason, they didn't notice that word was there. Okay? Now, it might sound unfair, but hear me out on this. If you go to the Hebrew text on this, and you take that one word out, the ESV translation kind of makes sense. You can see it going that way. You know, the way the structure of the sentence works and the words used, you can kind of make it work. But put the word back in, and it's clearly what the NASB has. I mean, that's the only way to translate it. It's really perplexing. It's like they just didn't see the word there, like they forgot about it. So I did some further study. You know, my first instinct is, okay, well, maybe there are some versions of the Hebrew Old Testament, you know, actual written texts from the ancient times that did not have that word. You know, maybe it was just left out in some copies. Well, as far as I can tell, that is not the case. As far as I can tell, and I have resources to help me with this too, as far as I can tell, the word meon, dwelling place, is always there. So it's just like, okay, were they asleep at the wheel? I mean, were they translating the Bible while groggy? What happened here that the ESV and the NLT somehow missed this word and gave a translation that really doesn't make any sense? And you might think I'm being unfair here, but fascinatingly enough, it seems like they also missed the word meon back in verse 29. Those of you, again, using the ESV, back me up on this. Go back to verse 29 in chapter 2, 1 Samuel. Read along with me, and just tell me if you see the word dwelling, okay? It's in the NASB, and I'm going to emphasize it. Just tell me if you see it. Verse 29. Why do you kick at my sacrifice and my offering, which I have commanded in my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by making yourselves fat with the choices of every offering of my people Israel? Did any of you see the word dwelling in there using the ESV? You have it? You guys have it. Okay, great. So they corrected it back in verse 29, but not in verse 32. And if you want to see my version of the ESV, I can show you. It misses dwelling in verse 29. It's like they messed it up. They figured out they got it wrong in verse 29, corrected it, and now they still forgot it in verse 32. It's weird. That's the only explanation I have. I see no reason for verse 32 to read what it reads in the ESV. I know it's weird, but the NASB is right. Sorry, there you go. The NASB is correct. And every other Bible translation on this verse except 2. And what the NLT was doing, I have no idea. Just maybe they were following the ESV. I know it's kind of a paraphrase.
Can you read verse 32?
Sure. In the NASB?
Yeah.
Okay. You will see the distress of my dwelling in spite of all the good that I do for Israel. What does yours say?
Yeah, it doesn't have the
Yeah. Yeah.
It says my dwelling, and the Spanish Bible says your dwelling.
Hmm. So, okay, since we're on the topic here, as I said, I spent a whole afternoon on this. So it just says dwelling. It doesn't give a pronoun. So you have to fill in the blank. The reason that the NASB probably says my dwelling and makes it the house of God is because this word is very often used for the tabernacle. So they're probably assuming based on word usage that it is, the dwelling place of God, the tabernacle. So that's my answer to that. I don't want to critique the Spanish translation. I'm already getting in heat here with the ESV. But anyway, for those of you following in the ESV reading this here, I think you should just switch over to the NASB for this one verse and trust it, because as far as I can tell after a whole afternoon of study, the NASB and most other Bible translations are correct on this point. So, having said all of that, what does the verse mean? Okay, again, the reading is, this is the punishment. It says, you will see the distress of my dwelling in spite of all the good that I do for Israel. And there you go. So what does that mean? What is the punishment here? What does it mean that Eli would see the distress of the dwelling place of God, Maon, the word that is very often used for the tabernacle there? Well, I think it refers to the last thing that Eli ever saw in his whole life. Because I mentioned to you that Eli himself dies on the same day that his sons die. And the reason that he dies is because he receives that distressing news about the Ark of God being taken. Let's go to 1 Samuel 4, verse 17, verse 18. Verse 17 and 18, rather. So 1 Samuel 4, 17 and 18. Okay. Then the one who brought the news replied, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the people, and your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been taken. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell off the seat backward beside the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for he was old and heavy. Thus he judged Israel 40 years. What a way to go out, huh? Okay, so here you have the ark of God. This is the centerpiece of the tabernacle. This is the one object that most represents the presence of God. It is the centerpiece of that tabernacle. Hey, let's take it out into the battle. Oh, we lost it. We lost the ark of God. If that's not going to make the high priest faint and fall backwards, I don't know what will. I mean, the centerpiece of the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God, the thing that represents God's very presence, was just stolen by an army of pagans. And your two sons are dead. That's the news that comes to Eli. And he faints, falls backwards, breaks his neck, and dies. That is what I think the distress of the dwelling place is. The distress of the dwelling place is the distress over losing the ark. And Eli saw it, and it was the last thing that he ever saw. So that's how I understand that second one. I know there's like weird stuff with the translation there. Then it gets interpretive. I know it's weird, but that's how I understand it. Okay. Last one, the last of these punishments. Okay, we'll plow through this here. I think we've got time. Sorry if this is going on longer than I thought. Okay, the third punishment, that the house of Aaron would become dependent on a new priest. This is where we get to that passage about God raising up the faithful priest who will have the enduring house and everyone bowing down to him who's left of the house of Aaron. 1 Samuel 2, verse 35 and 36. But I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and in my soul. And I will build him an enduring house, and he will walk before my anointed always. Everyone who is left in your house will come and bow down to him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread and say, please assign me to one of the priest's offices so that I may eat a piece of bread. All right, so the house of Aaron would soon become dependent on a new priest. They're going to come and beg this guy for silver, bread, and a job. Okay, they're going to be fully dependent. Now consider this my very first direct argument for the idea that David is the faithful priest and that David's house is the enduring house mentioned by the man of God. I have many arguments to make on this. I have about 9 messages worth of arguments to make for this throughout the whole book of Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel. Consider this my first direct argument, that David is this faithful priest. Okay, so you have the two sons of Eli dead, and then when the ark gets back into Israel, you have the whole city of Beth Shemesh being wiped out, Nob being wiped out, 85 priests being killed by King Saul, all this kind of stuff. I mean, you have all this terrible stuff. The house of Aaron is getting hit. Who comes in to make sure that they don't all die? David. After that slaughter of the priests by King Saul, there is another event here that I didn't read. 1 Samuel 22, verse 20. This is again right after the slaughter of the priests by King Saul. But one son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. Stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, for you are safe with me. The house of Aaron survived mainly because you have one guy keeping the man who is apparently the heir of the high priesthood at this point, Abiathar. David is the one who's promising to keep him safe. I mean, Abiathar is depending for his very life on David's ability to keep him safe at this point. He who seeks your life seeks my life, so stay with me. So David's the one keeping this priesthood going at this point. And it wouldn't just be protection either. I mean, where's this guy going to get food? I mean, who's the one getting food here? It's David and his men going on raids and stuff who actually get food and supplies to share with this guy. Abiathar is eating from David's table, basically, if he had a table. On the run, he probably didn't have a table. But the point is, David is the one keeping this guy safe and sound while King Saul is still alive. Furthermore, we can go even further than that, beyond this time. David's an outlaw now, but eventually he becomes king. When that happens, Abiathar becomes a priest, not as an equal to David, but merely as a member of David's administration. You get these passages from time to time where it lists out everyone who's serving under David as a kind of a department head in his government. One of them is in 2 Samuel 20, verse 23. Kind of list out here the heads of state under David here. 2 Samuel chapter 20, verse 23 says, Now Joab was over the whole army of Israel, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and Adoram was over forced labor, and Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud was the recorder, and Sheva was scribe, and Zadok and Abiathar were priests, and Ira the Jairite was also a priest to David. Okay, so you see David's government here. This guy's over this. This guy's over this. You have Abiathar there serving as a priest, part of David's administration, not as an equal to David, but merely as a member of his staff. Think about it like this. The high priesthood and the monarchy could have been two branches of government. You have the high priesthood over here doing its thing. You have the king over here doing his thing. There could have been two branches of government. That sort of thing has happened in history before, where you have a religious head of state and a secular head of state. It is possible. And the high priesthood, being much older and very influential, could have gone that way. It could have been the equal to the king. Instead, it's like this. You know, David's king, and this guy's over this, this guy's over this, this guy's over this. Oh, and by the way, Abiathar is priest. He's under David even now. And also, another oddity here, did you notice that there's another priest alongside Abiathar? Zadok. It says Zadok and Abiathar are the priests under David. So who's high priest? Is there a high priest? Does David just say, well, you two both are just kind of under me right now? I mean, it doesn't look, you don't see the high priest as his own man here. You see him as being very much under David, even very much sharing with someone else who seems to be his equal. This guy's Zadok. Think about all of that and remember what the man of God said. There's going to be a faithful priest. I'm going to make him an enduring house. Everyone left in your house is going to come and, beg him for silver and bread and ask to be assigned to one of the priest's offices. Well, it seems like here, David in his good grace said, okay, Abiathar, okay, Zadok, you're going to be my priest. And this other guy, Ira the Jairite, he's in there too somehow. It's just like, what's going on here? Well, it seems like David is the one over the priests. He's the one that kept them safe during the days of King Saul, after a lot of them were massacred, and he's the one calling the shots when he becomes king. All of that to say, you see the remnants of the priesthood of Aaron become very dependent and very subservient to David as David becomes king and goes on about his career. So, those are the punishments that the man of God gave against Eli. Let's just read them off again here. Yeah, first of all, the house of Aaron would be consistently afflicted by early deaths, including 2 whole cities of priests, and the massacre of the priests in the days of King Saul, all that stuff. You see that stuff happening. This people not reaching old age in the house of Aaron. Secondly, Eli, at least in some sense, saw the distress of the dwelling place of God when the ark was taken, and he took that so heavily that he fell over and broke his neck and died. Finally, the house of Aaron becomes dependent on a new priest, which, first argument for this, not my full argument, just part of the argument, I think David fills that role when you see him step in to keep the house of Aaron safe, and when you see him as king kind of calling the shots over the priests in his administration. So all that, you see those 3 punishments against the house of Aaron because of their wickedness. And that is what I mean by the failure of the priesthood of Aaron. Just to summarize those 3 things again, you have the great wickedness of the days, in these days here of Eli, where Eli and his sons are just very godless men officiating as priests. And for that reason, because of their wickedness, this man of God comes in and says, you have lost the priesthood. Even though God promised this to you perpetually, you have just lost the priesthood because of your wickedness. And then finally, you have these judgments, these 3 different judgments against the house of Eli, which is the house of Aaron. And part of that getting into these matters of David, I think, being the faithful priest, although that was just one aspect of the argument here. And that is all I want to talk about tonight on these things. If there are questions, fine. Next time I teach, I want to talk about another aspect of this, another sign, if you will, of the transfer of priestly power, and this time not as it pertains to people, but as it pertains to an object. I want to talk about next time the Ark of the Covenant, which has been mentioned somewhat tonight, and you might have get the idea that it's very important. It is important. I think there's something about the Ark of the Covenant in these early chapters of Samuel which also shows the transfer of priesthood away from the house of Aaron to the house of David. That's what I'll talk about next time. But for tonight, just the wickedness of Aaron's house and how that caused them to lose the priesthood. Okay, it was a very message tonight with a lot of things flying everywhere. But if there are questions, great. Let's talk about them now. Adam, you're kind of chomping at the bit here.